Hello and welcome to Banned Books Conversations, where radical readers discuss prohibited prose. I'm your host, Tonya Todd. Banned books are literary works that have been removed from a library shelf or school curriculum. Over the course of Banned Books Week, this series will cover 7 different banned books, the reasons they were banned, and the value in reading them. Today's book is Front Desk by Kelly Yang. I should warn you, there may be spoilers ahead. But before we get into that, let's meet our guests. I'm going to start with Veronica. Please tell us a bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on the show, Tonya. I really appreciate it. My name is Veronica Klash, Veronica with a C, Klash with a K. I am a writer, pretty much all short form. So anything from flash fiction to articles, personal essays. If it's short, I have written it and I have loved it. That's what I do.
How about you, Michelle?
Hi, yes. Hi, Tonya. I'm glad to be here to talk about this book, which I saw so much of myself in. I am an Asian American immigrant, and I quit my established corporate career when I realized I can't advocate for myself or anyone if I don't first admit my own struggles living with bipolar disorder. And so my writings since then, which focus on the intersection of Asian American identity, feminism, and mental health, have been hits for NBC News, CNN, InStyle, Reader's Digest, and a bunch more publications. And I've also served as a featured speaker on mental health for Microsoft, Twitter, Harvard, and many other universities and podcasts. And you can follow me on Instagram at Michelle Yang Writer if you would like to learn more about my work. Thank you.
She's kind of a big deal. Also a big deal is my guest, Oksana. Tell us a bit about yourself and what you do, please.
Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here. Also another immigrant. I'm a writer, an educator, and a Romani activist. And most of my writing centers on the exploration of what it means to belong somewhere new, whether that's physical, emotional, or mental state. And again, really excited to be here. Thank you.
So it was quite accidental to have 3 immigrants on this particular book.
It was really an accident.
It really was, but
wow.
Sure, accidental.
Well, you gave me multiple books that you were willing to review, as did Oksana. And Michelle, you're the one who introduced me to the book. And I just fit you guys where I needed someone to be on the show. And it was just kind of a surprise to me. Oh, wow, we have 3 immigrants here. Well, that's going to make for some interesting conversation. So I want to start with Oksana. Tell me what prompted you to participate in these conversations in general regarding the Banned Books Project?
Well, I mean, I feel like the immigrant experiences in general is not something that is highlighted, which is kind of ironic.
Well, I'm asking about when I asked you to be part of the Banned Books Conversations, why were you interested in participating in that? Not so much the books, that particular book, but the Banned Books Project.
That is why, because I feel like when something is banned, it needs to be addressed. Yeah.
Okay. How about you, Michelle?
Well, you know, banned books, it's an interesting conversation, right? I mean, it always is interesting because it depends on where do you fall. You know, I've been offended by some books. I know we'll get to talking to that later. And for me, it's especially important for children's books. And because, you know, they're like a sponge and they're, you know, very formative in where they're at. And I think it's really fascinating to me how much we disagree as a country, but, you know, I guess as a world too, on what is and is not okay for a child to read, you know. And so I think that's why banned books is also something that makes people passionate. And as someone who's written a book, a part of me is like, well, if it gets anybody passionate, that's kind of, it's fascinating. There's something worth talking about there.
Agreed.
Yeah.
How about you, Veronica?
Well, I think the idea of, excuse me, the idea of banning books is such a sort of societal marker, kind of like a harbinger of horrible things. So I think whenever a society starts en masse to ban books, it's an indicator of very unpleasant things to come. And I think it's worth addressing that.
Mm. Well, my next question is, have you ever been offended by a book? And Michelle, you already mentioned that, so go ahead and go first,
Yeah,
please.
so I have a son who is almost 9, and when he was in kindergarten, he brought home a book from his classroom, and it was called Dan the Flying Man by Joy Crawley, published in 1998. And it's like, seems pretty, non-controversial, because it's like basically a book to teach kids to read. And the words themselves actually are not controversial, or I did not have a problem with it. I didn't take issue with. What I took issue with when I was reading the book with him was realizing that there was an illustration of an Asian man who was a horrible caricature, slanty eyes, the Fu Manchu mustache. He had these, flip-flop thingies on, like a horrible like mismatch of different, just like a stereotype of what somebody who's not Asian would imagine a stereotypical Asian person would look like. And then on every page, he was the joke, right? He was the one being shoved down a mountain. He was the one drowning in the water. And, I was horrified, I was horrified.
I'm sure.
And I took it to my kid's kindergarten teacher, whom we loved. And she, was a very kind lady who's, white blonde hair, and I just showed her the photo thinking she would be aghast and embarrassed that she had this book in her classroom. And she kind of didn't understand. Like, I had to explain it to her that this was offensive. And so, but she wanted to do right. She just didn't know how. And so she said, I want to request sensitivity reader, or a sensitivity screener for the books that are in my classroom. But that's how I learned that none of the books that are in our children's classrooms were in any way curated. Like, the library books are beautifully curated for the most part. I think the librarians are very educated, they have degrees, but these books that are in the classrooms are just donated. And so they just like sit in there. And so if the teachers have time to go through them, then like maybe some will get culled out. But we all know our teachers are so overworked, and not compensated enough. And so they don't have time, so I actually ended up organizing parents, because I was like, do you have someone? Because I was like, thank you for thinking of asking for a sensitivity screener. Does the district offer, his public school, does the district offer someone? Do you have someone? And she said, no. I was like, would you like me to volunteer? And she said, yes. So I organized some parents, but it was controversial. People thought I was going to ban books, right? That I was going to be a book burner, and
and you're like, no, I'm a writer.
I kind of am, when there's offensive books that I found another book recently, and I got it pulled from my local library. I had it reviewed by the library board, and at least my local library, public library, decided to pull it. They unanimously, that one's called The Ugly Dumpling, and it's about a Chinese dumpling that befriends a cockroach in a restaurant, and a Chinese restaurant that has no Chinese customers. And then the end of the book is they run off and live in a dumpster. And I was like, what the,
what was the purpose of that book?
I don't know. I think it was supposed to be The Ugly Duckling, but Ugly Dumpling. And so in the first page of the book, it was I know what you're thinking. All dumplings are ugly. And I was like, what? Because I was like, you cannot, there's no way anybody who comes from an Asian culture or any culture that has dumplings would think that dumplings would, which is like a worldwide food, like dumplings appear in many different cultures. I don't think these handmade morsels of food, anybody would think they're ugly, right? So and that book was written and published in 2016, and so, yeah, I will complain and I was really actually grateful for how my local library here in town handled it. I got a call from the district, executive director, and yeah, they pulled that book. Yeah.
What about you, Veronica? Have you ever been offended by a book?
In a different way. So my background, I am originally from Israel. I'm Jewish. I have not read, not that I remember, any sort of anti-Semitic literature, but I think my sensibilities as a woman were offended, and I wrote about it when I read Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It offends me as a Las Vegan. It offends me as a woman. It offends me as a former hospitality worker. It offends me on so many levels. Yeah, that book brings out all sorts of hostile emotions within me. Yeah.
There's that passion again, though. Makes for an interesting review.
Yeah.
How about you, Oksana?
I mean, yeah. I'm, to be honest, offended pretty much by any book that references any Romani characters or has them in any cast, because it's almost, actually, it's always stereotypical. I don't think I've read a single book where it's not, which is kind of frightening, So that's an ongoing battle, because you see that those pop up here and there. In books like Mein Kampf, I'll always be offended by something like that. So I do like, that's why this conversation is so intriguing, because there is no right or wrong. You know what I mean? There are some books that I feel like should not even have been written. But there are others that I feel like they do push boundaries, but for a very good reason. So it's a difficult one for me to answer with just one straight answer, if that makes sense.
It did. So my next question, I'm going to ask of you first again, Michelle, because you've again already touched on it. Do you think there are ever any valid reasons to ban a book?
Yeah, I mean, racism, right? Racism, sexism, xenophobia, any sort of like oppression that, also there was another book that I threw away because I was like, what did I do with this book? Because I don't want it to somehow re-enter into the world. I ended up recycling it when it's consent. It was like teaching. I think for me, children's books are especially important because I think adults already have, opinions, and they can make a decision, even if I can read a book and be offended, but I know that I won't agree with it. But kids, like I don't want them to have information presented to them in a way that can, like that is, and it is very difficult, right? As a parent, like as someone that it's like, I'm not, like, of course they're going to have to experience things on their own. But like, there was this book that I found at the Goodwill that like had really cute illustrations. So I brought it home, but it was about like, you just keep tickling this duck, even though the duck says no, and says no a whole bunch of times. And then in the end, the duck starts enjoying it, and I'm like, no, that is not a message I want to teach my son, no means no, right? Like, and I was like, these are, I don't know why these books exist, and so therefore those are the books I'm going to curate out of our home. And hopefully, like, if I have anything to do with it, I will not expose children to it, because those are old messages that I don't want our future generation absorbing.
How about you, Oksana?
Do I feel like some books need to be banned?
Do you think that there is ever a valid reason to ban a book?
Well, yes. I mean, as I mentioned before, I definitely feel that there is a reason. If a book instigates violence against a group, whatever that group may be, if it promotes what Michelle just, mentioned, if it promotes unhealthy behavior, mental, physical, or emotional oppression of any sort, I do believe that there's no room for that narrative. But I have very strong opinions of certain types of books. But of course, somebody might be in this room and say, you know what, that book does not strike me as something that extreme, right? So, but personally, I really do. If I were, in charge of some committee that was deciding if there are any books that don't need to, appear, especially in front of our kids, then I would make some choices as a parent.
Veronica?
This is a difficult question, and I'm going to be contrarian and
I am too, so go ahead.
a little differently. I think initially when I thought about this question, my immediate answer was yes, absolutely. There are reasons. There are certain books that don't deserve an audience, but I think there's a difference between curating your children's experience. I think that's your responsibility as a parent. That's your job, right? To curate the way they're seeing the world. And that means the media that they're being exposed to. And books are certainly a huge part of that. But I think in the larger sort of conversation of society, it's all about context, right? You're not reading a book in a vacuum. There's a history behind it. There's context that goes along with it that can help us understand a different perspective, that can help us understand history in terms of just like an actual record of history. But do I think everyone should read everything? No, you're able to choose as an adult. This is not something that I want to engage with, and I won't. But I think it gets tricky when we start banning books and telling people, well, no one can read this and no one should read this, because who gets to make that decision, right? And what if that person is someone you don't agree with? What if that person is someone who has different views from you and what they consider offensive and horrible, like this? Someone considers this offensive and horrible. Who gets to decide? To me, that's the biggest question when you're saying, well, should books be banned? My immediate question is, who gets to decide that? Because the way the world is now, for the most part, it's white men who get to decide, and that's not necessarily the world that I want to live in.
Yeah, I guess it depends on where, right? Because the library board at my local library ended up voting to take the ugly dumpling out of circulation, right? And yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that it's the parents' responsibility to curate the experience for the children and offer that context so that they do as early as they can, once they know how to read, to be able to like make an opinion, to have an opinion, to know what's right from wrong. But at the same time, yeah, like if they're a 6-year-old, like I, as an immigrant, I immigrated when I was 9, was exposed to the world through the public library. Like my parents had very limited in what they could teach me about American life. They knew nothing. We worked in a restaurant, my parents, yeah, so I worked in the restaurant. So I called the library my American parent, and so, yeah, like I absolutely believe in the freedom of speech. And I know that it's like, I like both agree with you, Veronica, and also know the actions that I've taken to protect my child, right? Because of like, there are certain parts where I'm like, enough is enough, right? Because it's like, there are certain literary works, like you said, history, like that have value, that, that it's like, if taken out of like, there's like Adventures of Huck Finn, like Mark Twain's works, like just these classic authors that, had some views, Dr. Seuss, had some views that are under the modern lens, unacceptable. But like, does their prose have value? Do they have, like there's other story contexts that have value. Like, I think that they do. Like my son, we read Dr. Seuss together, you know, like there's, but it's, I don't think it's true for all books, you know, and I know you, like, I absolutely think you have a really good point that like who gets to decide, right? Like, and it can't just be all white men. And I think, but it's like, well, if in public arenas, that's why we have to affect who decides, right? Like, it's like, we got to take a layer, because if I don't want my child reading books that makes him believe Asians are ugly and Asians are stupid and Asians should be taken to the dumpster, then I'm going to need to do something, you know? So yeah.
See,
But
my
also,
automatic answer would have been no to that. Like, I don't think that we should be banning books unilaterally. I don't think that we should remove other people's choice from what they are allowed to bring into their lives. Whereas I think we should be doing that for our own children, for our own families. I don't like the idea of taking away someone's choice. But when you mentioned that book about the tickling, it gave me pause. And I mean, what is the value in that? What possible thing could we be putting out into the world that would be of value with that? I mean, it's only rape culture. That is the only, without reading it, of course. I would have to examine it myself to know for sure.
It's a picture book. There's not much. So like, I promise you, like I'm not like leaving anything out, you know, but like.
Well, let me ask you this, Michelle. What was the duck wearing?
Oh
the duck was naked. Yeah. I don't know.
Was the duck alone late at night walking home after drinking? Had they been drinking? Very, very important to know this about the duck.
Yeah.
This is really sad. I know we're laughing. Really sad.
You know, it's like, that's
I remember this reminded me of this incident. I was on a play waiting for at that time, I think he was in elementary school, my youngest son, waiting for him to come out of his classroom, and all the parents are waiting. And two parents were talking, and they were complaining about the teacher telling them that they had to do the homework with their kids. So this is elementary school, right? And I remember one mother, she said something like, they're supposed to be the ones taking care of homework. Like the teachers are supposed to be doing that. I'm not a teacher. Why am I supposed to be involved in this?
Homework.
Right? So we're talking about parents curating, but unfortunately, I would say that more parents don't than do. Like, you know, many parents are overworked, overstressed, you know, they have really no time. They're not.
My parents didn't, right? Because they were working.
So it's like, then how much responsibility do we put on the parents' shoulders? How many parents will know to even check? How many parents will think, oh, I need to make sure like these books that my kid is bringing home are appropriate. We assume they're appropriate because they come from school, right? So
would the efforts maybe be better spent in awareness about books that maybe we find offensive being in schools, rather than putting that effort toward removing it? Maybe educating the parents in those particular schools about what is there, so that they can make sure their kids are not reading it.
I think the answer is very complicated. It's very complicated. I think it's a societal awareness of parents, period, and how important it is for us to understand what we consume. You know, so it's not just, it goes beyond just this one small kind of bubble, you know, of like, what do our kids read in schools? It goes way beyond that. And it's basically educating our young before they decide to become parents, if they do, that being aware of what you're consuming is important, and it makes a difference, you know, and especially here, you know, on the Western side of the world, because of the sense of freedom and individualism, which is wonderful, and, you know, where I come from did not exist. We just make these assumptions that we know everything. Like, we don't have to be aware of it. Does that make sense? Like, we don't really have to check the information that comes our way. If somebody that we like, if a celebrity said this book is amazing, then this book is amazing.
That is the culture.
Right?
You're right about that.
Yeah, but where I come from, it's the opposite. Like, you don't trust anybody. Like, what is this? Let me look at this. What's going on here, you know?
Well, I think the thread that we're pulling at also kind of indirectly is the idea of what can our institutions, our educational institutions, what can they withstand and what can our parents withstand? And I think the kind of answer that's lurking behind both of those things is that there's a lack of support, right? There's a lack of support for parents in this country. There's a lack of support for educational institutions. So what ends up happening is that there's not enough energy, there's not enough time, there's not enough people to make sure that children are getting, if they are getting these messages, what do they mean? And what's the context? And let's have a conversation about this. Because if you're a parent working, 3 part-time jobs trying to make ends meet, you're not going to have time to sit down and have a nuanced conversation, even if that is one of your priorities. And even if that is something that you really want to do with your child, your schedule doesn't line up with theirs, or there's just not enough time in the day between making sure that they're getting fed to then making sure that well, what are they reading? And what does this mean? And what are the consequences of what they're reading? You're so focused on the bare essentials that some of this other stuff falls by the wayside. And obviously this is very important, but yeah, I think there's a larger societal issue at play here in terms of a lack of support, where ideally, yeah, parents would have time to be like, hey, what are you reading? What is this about? Let me see it. What are you learning from this? And, oh, this is kind of different than how I see things. Let's have a conversation about that. Let's have a conversation about what this means in the larger context of things. But I think that's a really unrealistic expectation to have.
It's also quite dangerous because from my experience, I immigrated here from former Soviet Union when I was 15, and the way that people were perceiving literature in general was drastically different from where I came from. In Soviet Union, when it became Soviet Union in after the revolution, 1918, one of the first things the new government did was to establish these centers all around the country that would read literature and censor it accordingly or rewrite it according to the ideology. That was done intentional. So I only learned this when I was a fellow at the Library of Congress, and I was researching it about 10 years ago. I did not know that my fairy tales that I grew up with were all rewritten and held this ideology to teach me things, right? In a very subliminal kind of subtextual kind of way. And I had certain beliefs about where I lived that I didn't even know were not my own, right? So there's so much power to literature that in this part of the world is absolutely ignored, And so that is frightening, because that means that anything can get through. The naked doves can get through and nobody bats an eyelash unless they know what to look for.
Right.
But it is important to understand the power of narrative and how it can shape society in general and what can do to new generations as they grow up.
Right, children in particular.
Right. And yet it's just not at all, it's kind of like, well, it's just books, just stories, not a big deal.
Well, repetitive narrative too, right? Because it wasn't just a
Yeah.
message in one story. It's the same message in several stories.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think the influence and the power comes from, is from that repetition.
Well, switching gears a little bit, I'd like us to now talk about the story that we all read. And Veronica, you said you would be willing to share the synopsis with everyone.
Yes, I would love to. So I'm just going to hold it up for our viewers at home. So we got to read Front Desk by Kelly Yang. We were introduced to Mia and her parents. She emigrated from China. She's a 10-year-old. They emigrated, 2 years ago? So they've been in the United States for about 2 years. They came to this country with a lot of hope, like most immigrants do, and it didn't turn out quite as rosy as she and her parents had expected. They were living below the poverty line. Things were pretty dire. And then it looked like things were about to change for them. Her parents got a job managing a motel called the Cala Vista for a Mr. Yao. The motel even had a pool, super exciting stuff for a 10-year-old and for an adult. If you've never lived with a pool before, I mean, that's pretty freaking exciting. But it turns out Mr. Yao is very miserly and racist and just generally a terrible person. But Mia doesn't let that deter her. She's very excited about working at the front desk and getting to know the sort of temporary, not so temporary residents of the motel, who she calls weeklies. So she befriends these folks. She also finally makes a real friend after moving from school to school. I think she said 8 times. She makes a real friend in Lupe, who introduces her to the idea of 2 different roller coasters. You have the rich people roller coaster and you have the poor people roller coaster, and it's really hard to get off the poor people roller coaster. She also encounters racism, microaggressions, humiliations, just a lot of your general 10-year-old adversity stuff, and then some. But she is an agent for change. She finds her power in letters, actual written letters and words, and she is able to affect a lot of positive change. And one of the things that her and her parents do pretty quickly after they start managing the motel is other Chinese immigrants pass through, escaping, fleeing from horrible circumstances, and the motel kind of becomes a safe haven of sorts, a place where they can kind of rest, recharge, and, you know, keep going on their way to bigger and better things. So it's truly an amazing story, reading about this little girl and her adventures at the motel.
Well, thank you for that. You did an amazing job, and I never would have been able to say it that well. I know we discussed this a little bit earlier, but forgive me, I don't remember if all of it was on or off camera or only some of it. So I'm going to again ask where everyone first heard about this book. Michelle, when I lit the banned book signal, you answered the call and introduced me to today's book, but how did you first hear about it?
I think it was, I actually don't recall, because as an Asian American, and I'm, follow all the Asian American book stuff, so I could have seen it on social media first, or I could have seen it through my public library, recommendations. So, somehow I found it, and I listened to it years before it was banned, and it made the headlines again because it went back up to I don't know that it even was a bestseller initially when it came out. It won awards, but it was when it was banned, I remember Kelly Yang, the author, posting about how it's it's, and then it became a bestseller because it was banned.
How about you, Oksana?
Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I'm trying to stay quiet for everybody else. So I actually learned it from you, Tonya, when you first had started, talking about banned books. And we're having conversations about what's on the list of banned books that's kind of on our minds right now. That came up, and it really caught my attention because of how familiar it felt to me. It was almost like I was reading about myself.
And Veronica?
Same, yeah. This book was not on my radar. I'm sad to say it was not on my radar previous to this. But yeah, I saw it on the list and read the sort of little summary, and I was like, oh, wow, this sounds incredibly interesting. And I'm dying to know what is so terrible about this book that people felt so compelled to make sure that no one ever reads it again. So, and that's the other thing about banning books, right? You're giving them a platform. That's the kind of double-edged sword of banning, is you're giving it some sort of elevated status for better or for worse. So yeah, that was when I first heard about the book.
I'm sorry, can we define the banned book? Because I thought it was just at that one particular school district. We're not talking nobody banned this book.
Molly. Yeah.
in a wider, right? It was just that a particular school district.
Just the fact that it was removed from the library, from the school, that qualifies it as a banned book.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to have like a clear definition
Yeah.
because there was a class that was reading it as a class, right? And that's why the parents complained, and then they had it removed from that.
Which brings us to our next topic, is what do you think people found so disturbing that they wanted to ban it? And we'll go ahead and start with you, Michelle.
Oh, well, I mean, I love the book, obviously. Like it was just like, it was one of the first, as a young immigrant who worked with my parents at our small restaurant, like I had, the author even shares my last name, and so I was just like, there are things that she wrote, I felt like I could have written, and it was just really amazing that I've never felt so seen. And I, in a middle grade book, right? And just in all books in general, I don't know that I've ever read that child working in a business doing, whether it be interpretation or whatever, like far beyond her age, right? Her maturity that should be, but she's like rising to the occasion, right? Like, and so I was just shocked when I learned that it was being banned and that there was so much controversy around this book, because I was like, but it's such a sweet book, and it's, and of course, like we live in a country with a culture war, going on. And I know it's like, okay, so people didn't like the way that police were being portrayed, that, the critical race theory is being, that was the short answer, Tonya, right? You're like, why was it being banned? And I said, oh, people think that it teaches critical race theory, and I'm like, even the roller coaster analogy, I'm sure people took issue with, because the privileged always want to think that they work their way to success while, everybody else is being lazy, and there's luck has nothing to do with it. Privilege has nothing to do with it.
Or opportunity has nothing to do with it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all about the bootstraps. That's really what it's about.
Bootstraps, exactly. So, yeah.
Oh, you have boots?
No, just straps.
What is
no boots?
What is a boot? What is a strap?
What about you, Oksana? When you were reading it, what were you thinking about the fact that it was banned, and what reasons came to mind about why someone would think that this should be banned? But I'm saving Veronica for last because I know she has opinions.
I think that somebody else's reality probably was very uncomfortable for this group of people, a reality outside of what they're familiar with. And I feel that, as an educator and an activist, especially in this country, people are more brainwashed than they think they are. And it definitely comes through in these moments of like emotional confrontation, when they're reading these narratives and it shows somebody else's reality and it's not your own. And the first reaction is to go back into that bubble where it's comfortable and not approach anything else, because this is not for us. We're simple people. We just want our kids to be happy. We don't need them to read these. Right. And it's, again, I keep saying it's sad, but it is sad, because as I was reading it, I'm thinking, well, a lot of these things are familiar to me. I went through so much of what she describes. How can this be banned? Like somebody else's life is banned because it's like not like your own in some way, right? And it's more difficult maybe, and a child has to grow up faster than your child. Like, why is that wrong? Why is it something that you don't want your children to acknowledge? It's part of our world experience, and we need it so much right now, right, to see these diverse stories.
Absolutely. And can I clarify for the listeners, because I don't think we talked about it, that the book is so much based on Kelly Yang's life,
Right.
And a lot of it is autobiographical, that like many scenes are like directly taken from her real life.
Yeah. And I did not know
So,
that when I was reading it. And there were
yeah.
certain situations where I was like, come on, really? I'm supposed to believe that this would happen? I mean, it's really fun and it's entertaining, but I don't believe this would be real. And then I read about her and it was, wow. At no point was I thinking it should be banned because some of the stuff seemed a little far-fetched. It just felt extraordinary. And, you know, some literature is about extraordinary characters doing extraordinary things. But when I read that this was based on her life, this thing actually happened, and I'm reading all of these things that were about her, wow. Well, yeah, this needed to be a book. This needed to be written. So Veronica, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't mention that in the synopsis. And that's part of what makes the story so compelling, is that it's based on her life. I was going along, really enjoying this, going, okay, I can see why some parents may be trepidatious. There's a lot of heavy topics here that maybe they feel their young children are not ready to handle. They're not ready to have these serious conversations. But then we got to the part with one of the weeklies, Hank, who happens to be a Black man, and then is falsely accused by the police. He's arrested for something he didn't do, or he's accused, but not arrested. He's arrested later for defending Mia's mother. But he loses his job, and Mia comes to him, and, you know, with all that forceful justice of a 10-year-old, like, this is so unfair, you know, when you're that young and life hinges so heavily on what's fair and what's not fair. And here she is being faced with this very clearly unfair situation where a man she cares about very much is very obviously falsely accused. And he just he doesn't seem outraged. And she's like, how are you not so upset by this? And he just very kind of dejectedly and matter-of-factly says, you know, I'm a Black man. This happens to me all the time. This is just the reality of the life that I live. And police do this to Black men and women all across this country all the time. And as soon as I read that, I was like, yep, there it is. That's why. That's why people don't want children reading this, because it paints police in a very realistic light in the terms of bias that police have as an institution. And it really acknowledges racism head on with receipts, right? Examples of like, these are the types of situations Black Americans deal with constantly, without justification. This is just their life. And I think the reality of that is not something, as now we know very well, is not something that white parents are excited to have their children confront or deal with or even know about. So as soon as I read that chapter, I was like, yep, that's it. That's why they don't want this book in the hands of children.
And now I would really like for the three of you, since you all happen to be immigrants, to share your reader reactions, both in line with your own stories and on your own, just reading the book in general. Because, you know, none of you are middle grade children, but you're reading this middle grade book. I found it to be a delightful read, even though I'm not the target audience, but I still enjoyed it. It was really fun. I thought it was well written considering the target audience. But since it was just such a surprise to me that you all happen to be immigrants, you know, it's just one of those things where the universe decides this is going to be my group, you know? So Veronica, why don't you start? Tell us your reader reaction going through this story.
It touched my heart so much. And I hope I don't start crying in the middle of this podcast. Again, obviously, I am not an Asian American woman. I was not an Asian American little girl. I was an Israeli girl who left Israel at 8 years old. My family moved to Chile, and I went to an American school. I didn't speak Spanish. I didn't speak English. I had to go to ESL classes. ESL, English is a second language. And all my friends were the other 3 Israeli little girls that went to the school because I only spoke Hebrew. So I could only befriend these other girls who would call me stupid because I didn't speak English, who would bully me and just treat me horribly, but they were my friends because there was no one else. It was just them. I literally couldn't communicate with anyone else. So I can definitely relate to the idea of people thinking you're stupid because you don't speak a language that you've just recently been introduced to that is completely foreign and different from the language you grew up speaking. And there are just so many moments here where she addresses the idea of, can you ever excel in a language that's not your own? And I remember feeling that exact same way. I'm never going to be able to master this. English is such a horrible, terrible language. Nothing is spelled the way it's said. There's exceptions to every single rule. Nothing makes sense. And I very much had the feeling of, I will never master this. I will never be able to do this. And there is a really amazing satisfaction reading this as an adult who, I'm not going to say mastered because, well, but who has a really good comfort with the English language, so much so that I choose to write in that language. And there's one moment in particular towards the end of the book where she's been working on her English. She's been using a dictionary. She's been writing these letters. She's been putting in the work and the effort. And the teacher calls her up to the front of the class to really commend her on a short story she's written and has her read it in front of the whole class. And I had this very vivid memory that I haven't thought about in a very long time, where as part of like an ESL graduation thing, we all had to write speeches. You had to choose your topic and then write a speech and then deliver the speech. And I did it. And I won first place. I won a medal for the speech that I wrote and delivered. And I want to say, I wish that was where the story ended. And it was like, and I ran home with my medal and I rubbed it on all those little asshole little girls' faces. But that's not what happened. I won the medal and my best friend was upset because I was the stupid one. And how dare I win instead of her? And instead of being outraged at her response and her reaction, which is something that you see, like the friendship between Mia and Lupe, the little note that Lupe leaves her to participate in the contest, to support her. I didn't have that moment. I can't believe you won. You're stupid. Why? How could you have possibly? And I consoled her. And I said, you know what? It's not because I'm better. It's because you did your speech on gorillas and I did my speech on dinosaurs, and people just like dinosaurs better. So that was, seeing Mia have that moment really just struck a chord with me.
How about you, Michelle? I know you
Yeah,
touched a little bit on it earlier, but I want to hear your reader reactions.
Yeah, no, I thought this book was so intelligently written. It wasn't written, it's so multidimensional. I think that because I am Chinese American, but I'm ethnic Chinese born in Korea. So I have kind of a, part of the Chinese diaspora, more complicated. And I really appreciated how Kelly Yang kind of broke down the Taiwanese, because Mr. Yao is Taiwanese and her family's Chinese, and how much Mr. Yao looks down on her Chinese family. And I'm kind of always been somebody who's been caught in between, because my family's from northern China, but I was born in Korea and my parents were born in Korea. It was my grandparents' generation who, left a long, generations ago, right? Left China. But because we have the citizenship is through your paternal line. Like, we never had Korean citizenship. We faced a lot of discrimination in Korea. And like I went to a Chinese school. So, but I spoke Korean, I'm culturally Korean also, but we were never allowed to like embrace that part of ourselves. And my parents met in college in Taiwan. And so and because China, due to communism, was like closed off until 1990, which was the year we immigrated, I never went to China until like I was 16. I visited with family for like a weekend, like, when we were in Korea already. And so I was always like conditioned from my parents more of a Taiwanese point of view. And Kelly Yang is absolutely right. Like she is pretty, like comes across pretty visceral, I think, in her criticism of Mr. Yao and the Taiwanese. But I, as a person who observed it all, I think it's 100% deserved, that, and I was really moved by the truth. And, this book is the first of a series, and I've actually read the second one, and I think I read the third one as well. It's been a while, but she really corrects that storyline later on, for more spoilers for the future, series, but like Jason becomes a friend, and like she helps break that generational hate, because so, and I have done that, like what my parents teach me about what mainland Chinese are and how Taiwanese are, like I choose not to believe those things, right? Like, I think that's just ridiculous, right? And so I'm glad that Kelly was able to do that for the rest of the books, and like that kind of nuance and the Lupe storyline, like Veronica already mentioned, it's like there's these even in immigrants, right, the different levels of privilege. You have somebody like Jason who lives in a mansion, who is like very wealthy, and then you have somebody like Mia, who is poor, but they have citizenship, or not citizenship, they have papers, right? And then there's somebody like Lupe who's undocumented, and they can't, like, so it's like they both can't participate in PE for different reasons, right? Like Mia, because she has no health insurance, and then Lupe, well, I mean, I don't know, I don't remember the exact detail, but like they both had very good reasons, but one was like more dire than the other, and I really appreciated shedding that light that I feel like, growing up as in work, like I was 12 years old and working. And I remember growing up in suburbs of Phoenix, none of my friends could relate or understand, like working as a 12-year-old, that your parents relied on you to show up for your, for your shift after school. They can't imagine that. So I love that this book gives children all over an insight into that kind of life.
How about you, Oksana?
Well, I had some conflicting feelings about it. I mean, I love the way that it was written, and I agree with Michelle. It's a very intelligent book, and sometimes it sounds like it's written for more than the age group that it was, meant for. I really appreciated that. Another feeling I had about it, though, is that it was exhausting, because I was reading things that were familiar, and I'm like, oh my gosh, when is this going to end? Not the book, but like the stuff that children have to go through as immigrants. Like, when is this going to end? And not just children, like the character of Hank, why is all this necessary? Like, why do we have to go through these hardships and all of this stuff? And so at times, like, I actually procrastinated reading the book, because it was making me feel these not so positive feels, and I didn't know how to deal with them. But I mean, maybe that's why it makes this book so multifaceted, that like an immigrant can read this and be like, oh my gosh, I see this, and this is so much, and why is this still happening? Now, something that I noticed, and I don't know if any of you would agree, and I only noticed it because, so I wrote a memoir about my immigrant experience called American Gypsy. And I wish now that I wrote it, I wish I had written it as a fiction like she did, so I could remove myself a little bit from the experience, because people talk to me about my book even to this day, and it's been almost 10 years since it came out. And they ask me these very personal questions, and I wish I could just say, oh no, that's the Oksana, the fictional Oksana in the story, right? That like wasn't me, but I can't do that. But quite a few usually PhD students who are doing dissertations analyzed my book. And I saw in several papers where somebody from Europe, a PhD student from Europe who was doing their dissertation and were using my book, would mention that my book was really an American narrative, in that there is so much individual choice. So when I was, and myself in my memoir, Mia really reminded me of the stuff that I was doing, which is what people were like, no, you have to go to ESL because you have to learn. And I was like, I'm not going to stay in ESL. I'm going to a regular English class. And like, I made it happen, right? Even though I struggled, I'm going to take Shakespeare before I even speak English. And I like barely passed Shakespeare because it's insane, right? But I wanted to prove to myself and everybody else that I can be an American. Like that was important, right? And so, and the people who were doing the analysis, they were like, these kinds of experiences where you're like, I'm going to be an individual and have autonomy of my story and push past these social constrictions and expectations are it's an Americanized experience. And so they were saying, she's no longer writing it as an immigrant would write it. Really, she's like straddling two worlds. And I wonder when Kelly wrote, I think she immigrated young too, right? Pretty young.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that also is part of her storytelling at this point when she's writing this book.
I want to push back on that though, because how can they say that you're not writing from an immigrant perspective? You are an immigrant. The perspective you have is an immigrant's perspective. Just because it doesn't perfectly align with the way you would think an immigrant, just because maybe you've assimilated some of the individualistic, some of the that agency.
May I add that you can be an immigrant and an American? Like those things coexist.
That's true. I guess something more specific that I remember now that somebody mentioned was that, for example, that freedom, the basic freedom of choice, right? You choose, like Mia chooses to, apply to this contest, and she chooses to put a tip jar, like she has very particular, she talks to Officer Phillips and all of that stuff. And I think the people that were, it wasn't a critique, it was just observations, mostly from often Roma students from Europe, is that, Roma people in Europe still live in ghettos and you do not have a choice. You cannot go outside of your neighborhood and rent an apartment because you have money, because the way you look gives you away. And you literally do not have that choice, right? So from that perspective, me saying I can do whatever I want is not every immigrant's experience, which is I'm not saying that's as a criticism, because maybe that's the reason why these books are important, because it shows that there are places where you learn how to make choices, right? You don't have to, and the possibility of it. I mean, I remember personal experience when I was touring in Europe and I was meeting with a group of kids, Roma kids, and they were asking me, little girl, probably around 10 years old, she said, so what do you do in America? And I said, well, I teach at a university, I'm a best-selling author and all this stuff. And she's like, oh, a gypsy can do that? And I started crying on the spot, because I'm like, oh my gosh, like this kid thinks that there's no choice, right? That you can't do certain things. And so I had like all of this mixture of emotions when I was reading it, like conflicting emotions. I loved it, but at the same time, it was like, it made me feel depressed a little bit, because not everybody could be in Mia's shoes, even though, her story is so difficult, right? She's going through these hardships and all these other people are going through the hardships. So it definitely raised a lot of emotions and questions, which is why I do appreciate it. In the end of the day, it's important. That's why it's important to read these narratives, right?
Yes, it is. Which brings us to our last question. And we will start with Michelle. Why do you recommend Front Desk, and what do you hope people will gain from reading it or sharing it with their children?
Yeah, I think that I already kind of covered it throughout, but I was also, like Veronica, an ESL student. When I first immigrated, I knew no English. I felt stupid. I felt it was overwhelming, right? That I was like, I'll never understand English. And also you had this expectation, like you're carrying all your parents' hopes and dreams. And like there was all of these that it's like, oh, expectations that kids will learn really quickly, you know, that you don't have to worry about kids learning English. They'll just pick it up like, you know, in their sleep. And I had to work really hard, you know, and it was very anxiety inducing. And I was like depressed at age 9. I was crying myself to sleep. There was a lot of struggle and loneliness and, you know, homesickness, that the trauma of immigration that we don't talk about in America, because like the narrative is like of gratitude, you know, we're so lucky to be here. And yeah, we are lucky to be here.
Yes,
you know,
and
yeah, you can be both. Yeah, they can be both. Both narratives can exist at the same time, and we're only now reckoning with that, you know. And this is such a complicated story that is weaves together so many different perspectives. You know, I like that it's not like just an Asian American story, right? Like her best friend is Lupe, and, you know, Hank, and like all these, it weaves together so many issues that America is facing today. And I think it like boils up down to, for a young audience, in an engaging way. And so I think that's why it is a really important read. And I'm really excited that my child has it, you know, available, and that other children will read it. Like I know that, you know, my kids' school, like this was before it was, you know, this was in Seattle when I used to live in Seattle, but like that their 4th grade was reading it as a class, you know. And so I hope that even though that we have the one example of one school banning it, that there are hundreds and thousands of other schools around the country that are teaching the book. Yeah.
How about you, Oksana?
I mean, Michelle said it all, really. I mean, I feel like adults should be reading it. Like if there are book clubs, I feel like somebody should say, look, I know it's a book that's written for middle grade, but like we need to read this. Like it could be an educational experience for adults who are maybe not sure about how to present these more difficult conversations to their children, right? And I feel like it tells stories that we know are around but do not see, right? We don't experience them themselves, or the stories ourselves. I'm not a Chinese American, you know, I'm not a Chinese immigrant, I'm not an Asian immigrant, and the story, even though there's so many similarities, it's still not my story. And that's important, I think, also for people of other cultures to understand. I understand that there's always this conversation about, you know, the one particular group of people versus everybody else, but I think everyone needs to be informed about everyone. And something like this can do it easily, you know, because it's a well-written story with compelling characters. You know, it is easy to read, just generally.
Such an easy read.
Yeah. And yet it packs so much into it. So if anybody were to start anywhere, if they want to learn more, this would be a place to start.
Veronica.
Besides the fact that it's incredibly well written and very well done, just an absolute masterpiece of middle grade literature. To me, there's 2 sides to this, right? There's the representation. If you are someone like Michelle, this is you, you get to see yourself, and what an amazing thing that is for people who are not used to seeing themselves and their story being treated so respectfully and so just beautifully. How amazing for that little girl, that little boy, to see their story told just masterfully. But then also the other side of that is kids who this is not their story, but they get to feel that empathy. They get to feel that connection. And it does for them what books have always done, right? They're a window into someone else, into something else, into a world that's maybe not your own, but you feel as if it is your own and you form a connection. That's the amazing thing that books do, especially for children. So yeah, this is important for those kids who can see themselves in this story, but I think equally important for kids who don't see themselves in this story, to get that connection, to gain that understanding. And besides all of the amazing things that we've talked about, the experience that she's unfolding for us, there are so many amazing lessons here for children. And, you know, Oksana was talking about how the agency that she was showing kind of seemed to that student that it pulled away from her identity as someone who is Roma. But this is kind of the genre, right? If you're writing middle grade, the kids have the agency. Otherwise, people don't want to publish it. Folks who publish middle grade, they want the children to have the agency, to be the catalyst for change, to be the people. They're not running to the adults going, help me. They're going, oh no, I see the problem. I see it so clearly, and I know what I need to do to fix it, and I'm going to do it. So seeing this little girl, and I don't want to spoil the ending, but seeing her pull off something so momentous and so huge, and she doesn't do it alone, but she is the driver. She is the one pushing things forward, pulling things together, and people. And I think that's wonderful for children to see. You can make change. You have the power. Yeah, you're not going to change the world. You're not going to change the Mr. Yaos, but you have other recourse. There's other things that you can do. And one of the things that I think about when I was reading this book is this young woman, well, she's a young girl here in Vegas. She opened up her own store. She has her own brand, and it's all about driving inclusivity and just being a force for good. And yeah, that's exactly the type of little girl that I see Mia being. And I hope other little boys and girls and non-binary children see that as well for themselves, that they can be that. They can be that change that they want to see.
You know, you just reminded me of something I was thinking kind of to add to that. I mean, we are witnessing in this story deep social justice work at play, like right there. What can you do, right? She is changing not only her life, but also her parents and everyone around. And I mean, that's an introduction of what, that you do have power, you do have agency. Yeah. You know, we're often told, well, you can't change the world, you know, oh, the environment is dying, well, there's nothing you can do about it. Oh, this is happening, well, there's nothing you can do about it. But something like this kind of a narrative says, well, actually, you can do something about it, right? And you don't have to worry about how much impact it will have too far away from you, but you can do it within your neighborhood, right? Yeah. Within your life story.
And those things have ripples.
And you can try. Yeah, you can try. You're not always going to succeed, but you can try.
Well, thank you, ladies. This has been, I knew that all of you would be amazing, but this was even more fascinating than I expected. Please let the audience know where they can find you. We will start with Veronica.
I am on Instagram and on Twitter. Honestly, I'm a lot more on Twitter these days than Instagram. In both places, at Veronica Klash. Again, Veronica with a C, Klash with a K. The young girl that I was talking about, the brand is Tofu Tees. So if you want to support an enterprising young girl, Tofu Tees is a great place to do that.
And if you send that to me, I will add it to the show notes. Oksana?
I am on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter under my name, so Oksana Marafioti.
And your book?
My book, as I mentioned, is American Gypsy. So give it a try. Give it a try. Read this one, read Front Desk, and then read American Gypsy and see.
Ooh, as a companion piece.
Yes. And Michelle.
Yes, you can find me on Instagram at Michelle Yang Writer, also on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter as Michelle H. Yang, but I'm on Instagram the most, or yeah, so.
And I'm Tonya Todd. You can find me across social media at Ms. Tonya Todd, or follow me on my newsletter at mstonyatodd.com. Thank you for listening and watching, and go read Front Desk.